The sunlight glinted off the pristine fairway at Riverside Country Club, casting long shadows across manicured grass that looked almost unreal in its perfection. This was the kind of place where membership costs more than most people's houses, where fortunes are made in conversations, where deals are closed over martinis and the unwritten rules about who belongs matter more than anything printed in the bylaws. For Marcus Thompson, it was supposed to be his sanctuary. He stood on the terrace overlooking the 18th hole, a tall man with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades climbing toward something. At 52 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines on his face that told stories of long hours and constant pressure, Marcus embodied the kind of success that doesn't come from luck. It comes from obsession. His real estate empire. Thompson Development had grown from nothing into something substantial. From his early 20s, when he was working nights at a warehouse while attending community college, to now, over 20 years later. He'd built something worth $45 million. He'd transformed neglected neighborhoods. He'd created affordable housing that actually worked. He'd generated over $600 million in economic activity across the city. He employed hundreds of people. He'd changed the landscape, literally and economically. But more than the money, more than the success, it was the victory of belonging. Riverside Country Club wasn't just a golf club. It was where the city's elite gathered. The mayor came here. The police chief was a member. The district attorney played golf here. The CEO of the largest bank in the state networked here. This was where power was distributed, where decisions that shaped the city were made in quiet conversations between men who understood each other. 3 months ago, Marcus had been invited to join. 3 months of feeling finally like he'd truly arrived. Like his net worth mattered more than his skin color. Like he'd transcended the ceiling that had always seemed to exist in certain spaces. 3 months of believing that the rules had changed for him. He'd finished his round at 78, playing better than usual. The weather had been perfect. The day had been good. He was sitting at a table on the terrace eating a salad he'd ordered from the club's restaurant, reading the afternoon edition of the Riverside Tribune. His Range Rover was parked outside. His life felt in that moment exactly as he'd imagined it should feel. The terrace was crowded that afternoon. It was a Saturday, and the club always filled up on weekends. Golf was finished for most people by that hour. What remained was the social ritual, the eating and drinking and talking that came after. Marcus had always loved this part, the belonging, the casual ease with which men moved through these spaces. Men who didn't have to think about whether they were welcome. Men who looked like them anyway. Marcus had spent his whole life thinking about whether he was welcome. That was the burden that came with being a black man in spaces designed by and for people who looked nothing like him. Even now, after all his success, after all his money, after he'd literally built parts of the city with his own capital and vision. The old instinct remained, the instinct to check in, to verify, to make sure. 3 months at Riverside had been teaching him something different, that maybe he could stop checking. Maybe he could just exist. Maybe belonging could be something he didn't have to earn every single day, with another achievement, another project, another $1 million. He was learning to believe in that when Officer Derek Munson walked across the terrace toward him. He had no idea that in the next 30 minutes, a single police officer's prejudice would create a chain reaction that would reach the mayor's office, the police chief's desk, and the front page of the local newspaper. He had no idea that the sanctuary he'd fought so hard to access would become the stage for his humiliation. He had no idea that being $45 million successful would turn out to mean almost nothing in the face of assumptions rooted in something far more primitive. And he had absolutely no idea that his salvation would come in the form of a man with genuine power, a man who would choose to use it. Officer Derek Munson, at the same moment, was finishing his own round. Munson had been a member of Riverside for 5 years, a perk that came with his job as a police officer. The club's owner appreciated having law enforcement around. The police union negotiated the discount as part of their benefits package. It gave men like Derek Munson access to spaces where money usually mattered more than anything else. Though in Munson's case, he didn't have the money. He had the badge. Derek Munson was 48 years old with the thick neck and squared shoulders of someone who'd spent his whole life expecting physical obedience from others. His face carried a permanent scowl, the kind that made people instinctively defer to him, that made them assume he was angry even when he wasn't. He just looked like he was. He'd been on the Riverside police force for 22 years. 22 years of traffic stops, noise complaints, the occasional bar fight, the rare domestic violence call, the ordinary work of an ordinary cop in an ordinary suburban town. But somewhere in those 22 years, the badge had stopped being a symbol of public service. It had become, in Munson's mind, something else entirely. It had become a license. It had become permission. His personnel file told a story that most police departments would have found alarming. 7 complaints of excessive force filed against him over the past 6 years, all of them involving minorities. All of them investigated. All of them dismissed without discipline. The system had taken his worst impulses and had essentially told him, "You are protected. You are untouchable." And Derek Munson had believed it. The thing about Munson wasn't that he was overtly racist in the way people talked about anymore. He didn't use slurs in public. He didn't belong to any explicitly extremist groups. He was, by the surface metrics of modern life, a normal guy. But he carried with him a set of assumptions, unexamined, deeply rooted, almost cellular in nature, about how the world should work, His father had been a cop. His grandfather had been a cop. They'd told him things when he was young, about the neighborhood, about how you had to maintain order, about how certain people understood authority and certain people didn't, about how the job was about protecting good people from bad people, and you could usually tell the difference by looking. These lessons had been absorbed so deeply that Munson didn't even recognize them as lessons anymore. They were just facts, the way the world worked. And in his world, wealthy black people triggered something. They triggered resentment. They triggered a sense that some fundamental rule had been violated, a rule that everyone understood but nobody said aloud. These people. The phrase appeared in his internal monologue, though he would never have said it to a supervisor. These people thought they could just buy their way into spaces they didn't belong. They thought money could erase everything else. They thought they were equal, and Derek Munson believed it was his job to remind them where they actually stood. He was walking across the clubhouse when he saw Marcus sitting alone on the terrace. Something about the image bothered him. A black man alone at Riverside, not working in the kitchen or maintaining the grounds, sitting at a member's table, in members' clothes, confident, at ease. It violated something in Munson's ordering of the world. He approached Marcus's table with his posture already shifted. He was no longer a member taking a break from golf. He was an officer. The transformation was instantaneous. He straightened. His jaw tightened. His entire body language changed to communicate a single message. "I have authority here. Excuse me. Are you a member here?" Marcus looked up from his salad. He recognized Munson from the course. They'd passed each other on the fairway. Marcus had noted him with the casual awareness he maintained at all times, a habit from years of moving through spaces where he was almost always the only black person. You learn to read a room. You learn to notice when someone's eyes tracked you differently. "Yes, I joined 3 months ago. Marcus Thompson." He extended his hand. It was a friendly gesture, an assumption of brotherhood. 2 men at the same country club, occupying the same space, sharing the same membership. Surely that created some baseline of mutual respect. Munson didn't take the offered hand. "I need to see your membership card," Munson said flatly, not asking, demanding. Something shifted in Marcus's chest. It was subtle, a cold feeling, the kind of intuitive recognition that comes from having moved through enough situations like this to know the pattern. But Marcus had spent his whole life interpreting hostility as confusion, assuming good faith where there was none. He'd learned to do this because the alternative, accepting that people simply didn't want him in certain spaces, was too painful. Of course. Is there a problem? I've had reports of someone suspicious in this area. Someone who might be here to sell drugs or commit theft. When I see someone who fits the description, I investigate. Marcus heard what was actually being said beneath the words. The description was, black man, in a nice place, in a space where black men weren't supposed to be unless they were working. The description was threat. The description was illegitimacy. The description was everything Marcus had worked 20 years to prove he wasn't. The description is a 5'10" black male in golf clothes eating lunch at the country club where he's a paying member. He held out his membership card. It was pristine, official, embossed with his name. Marcus Thompson, platinum membership level, joined June 2023. Munson looked at it for a very long time. Too long. He could clearly see that it was legitimate. The system would have verified it when Marcus joined. The card itself was authentic. The font was correct. The numbers lined up. There was no ambiguity here, no legitimate reason to doubt. But instead of apologizing, instead of walking away with a polite excuse, Munson's face darkened. This could be fake. Membership cards are easy to forge. These days anyone can print anything. You probably got someone to make this for you. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. This was the moment when he should have walked away. This was the moment when a smarter man, a man with nothing left to prove, would have said, "Go ahead and call the front desk. They'll confirm everything." Or simply, "I'm done with this conversation." But Marcus had spent 52 years moving through white spaces, and he'd developed a reflex. The reflex was to cooperate. The reflex was to prove his legitimacy through reasonableness. The reflex was to assume that if he just remained calm enough, smart enough, well-spoken enough, then people would recognize his value. You can call the front desk. They'll confirm my membership immediately. They have my ID. They have my application. They have my payment records. I don't need to call anyone. I'm conducting an investigation. And right now, you're acting suspicious. The fact that you're getting defensive is making me think you do have something to hide. This is where the real cruelty of the system reveals itself. It's not that police officers need actual evidence. It's that they can reinterpret anything as guilt. Compliance becomes evasion. Calmness becomes deception. Politeness becomes a tell. Cooperation becomes consciousness of guilt. "I'm not being defensive," Marcus said. His voice remained pleasant professional. He could feel people watching now. Other club members had glanced over. A woman at the next table had paused mid-sentence. The restaurant manager stood at the door, uncertain whether to intervene. Staff members had stopped working. His moment of belonging was evaporating in real time, transforming before his eyes into something shameful. "You're raising your voice," Munson said. This was a lie. Marcus's voice hadn't changed pitch at all. It had remained calm and controlled, steady, quiet even. But the lie didn't matter. What mattered was establishing a narrative. What mattered was making sure that if anyone asked later what happened, it would be Munson's version that stuck. Marcus was being difficult. Marcus was being uncooperative. Marcus was being aggressive. "I'm not," Marcus said quietly, even quieter than before. "Don't contradict me." Munson's voice had shifted now. It was harder, the voice of a man who was tired of being questioned. A voice that carried the weight of a uniform and a weapon and a system that had always backed him up before. Marcus felt it then. a moment of internal breaking. Some belief he'd been carrying for 52 years. Some hope he'd maintained despite overwhelming evidence, just cracked. The belief that if he did everything right, if he was just smart enough and successful enough and well-spoken enough, then people like Officer Derek Munson would see him as equal, that his net worth would protect him, that his achievements would transcend the weight of his skin. They wouldn't. The money didn't matter. The achievements didn't matter. The respect he'd earned from everyone else at this club didn't matter. The buildings he'd built didn't matter. The jobs he'd created didn't matter. The lives he'd changed didn't matter. He was black. That was the only description that mattered. "I'm going to need you to stand up," Munson said. His voice had taken on the tone of a command now. "Something you didn't refuse. I'm going to conduct a pat-down. For my safety." A pat-down. At a country club. For the crime of eating a salad while black. For the crime of being in a place where membership costs more than most people's houses. For the crime of belonging. The dissonance was complete. The humiliation was total. Marcus looked at the faces around the terrace. The bank CEO who'd exchanged golf scores with him earlier in the week. The woman who ran the largest law firm in the state. The restaurant manager. The other club members. Everyone was watching. Everyone could see what was happening, and everyone in that moment had to choose whether to act or to pretend it wasn't their problem. Every single one of them chose silence. The choice itself was a communication, a message. Marcus understood it clearly. "You are on your own. We will not risk our position for you. Your belonging here was conditional, and the conditions have been revoked." Marcus understood in that frozen moment what was about to happen. He understood the mathematical odds. He understood the historical pattern. He understood that one moment of visible anger, one gesture that could be interpreted as aggressive, could transform this public humiliation into something much worse. He understood that the system was designed to protect the officer, not the citizen. That if he fought back, if he showed the rage that was building in his chest, if he stood up and told Derek Munson exactly what he thought, it would become evidence against him. He understood that he was one moment away from becoming a statistic. The news would report it differently, of course. It would say an officer was assaulted. It would say the subject became combative. It would say the officer feared for his safety. Marcus understood how these stories were written. He'd read them before. He'd watched the videos. He knew how the ending went. "Okay, I understand." He stood up slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements controlled. His heart was pounding. His mouth had gone dry. His hands had started to sweat. The stories flashed through his mind. Not headlines, but faces. George Floyd. His face pressed to the asphalt, his voice saying he couldn't breathe. Breonna Taylor, shot in her own bed, in her own apartment, at night, while sleeping. Amadou Diallo, shot how many times? 41, for reaching for his wallet. Eric Garner, saying "I can't breathe," over and over, saying it 11 times. These weren't theoretical stories to Marcus. They were warnings. They were proof that compliance wasn't always enough, that cooperating didn't always protect you, that a black man in a vulnerable position, being searched by a cop who felt disrespected, was in genuine danger. Officer Derek Munson reached out his hand. His fingers were inches from Marcus's shoulder. And that's when everything changed. "Derek, stop." The voice cut through the terrace like a blade. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was just absolute. It was the voice of someone so accustomed to being obeyed that he didn't need to raise his volume. He didn't need to perform authority. He simply was authority. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway of the country club restaurant was Mayor James Patterson. He was 61 years old, with the kind of bearing that came from military service, from decades in politics, from a life spent in rooms where his word was final. He was in golf clothes like everyone else, but he wore them like a uniform. There was something in his posture that communicated. I run this city. Derek Munson's entire body went rigid, his face flushed pale. Mayor Patterson had been finishing his own lunch inside the restaurant when a staff member had quietly informed him that something unusual was happening on the terrace. Patterson had heard enough in his life to know what that meant. He'd come outside to witness it. And what he saw was one of his trusted colleagues and board members being humiliated by a man with a badge and no justification. Mayor Patterson walked across the terrace with the deliberate pace of a man who expected everyone to listen. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The room had already shifted its entire gravitational center toward him. Patterson and Marcus had a history. Not just golf buddies or acquaintances. They'd worked together on the city's affordable housing initiative 3 years ago. Patterson had visited Thompson Development's projects, had seen the impact firsthand, had watched Marcus take land that most developers considered worthless and transform it into communities where people could actually afford to live. Patterson had asked Marcus to sit on the city's development commission. They'd had dinner together. They'd discussed strategy. They'd talked about the future of the city. Patterson knew Marcus Thompson not as a black man trying to fit in, but as a peer, as someone who'd contributed something real to the city. Derek, explain to me what you're doing, Munson stammered. His professional demeanor had cracked. Sir, I was conducting an investigation. There were reports of suspicious activity. By all means, Patterson said calmly, finish your pat down. But do it in front of me. And then explain to me why you're investigating a man who is a paying member of this club. A man I know personally. A man who has done more for this city than you ever will. That last sentence hung in the air like a weapon. A man who has done more for this city than you ever will. It was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone with absolute power. It wasn't angry. It was just factual. Just true. Derek Munson had spent 22 years on the police force, and in those 22 years he'd made traffic stops, written citations, answered calls. He'd done his job. He'd followed orders. He'd enforced laws. He'd done what he was told. Derek Munson would leave his job with nothing to show except a paycheck and, if things went well, a pension. Marcus Thompson, in the same period, had built something, had created something, had changed the city, had created hundreds of jobs, had housed thousands of people, had transformed the landscape, had contributed something tangible and lasting to the world. Patterson's implicit point was devastating. In any meaningful measure, Derek Munson's life was small. Munson's hand fell away from Marcus's shoulder. It fell like a confession. I think there's been a misunderstanding. You didn't realize, Patterson's voice had become even colder now, that a man can be both black and a member of Riverside Country Club. That's interesting. That's a very specific assumption to have. That's the kind of assumption that gets you fired. The word fired hung in the air like a threat, because that's what it was. Derek Munson in that instant understood something he'd probably never fully grasped before. He wasn't dealing with a fellow member. He wasn't dealing with someone he could intimidate or manipulate or hide from. He was dealing with the most powerful person in the city, not just in terms of title, though he was the mayor, but in terms of real power, institutional power. Mayor Patterson's wife's brother sat on the police commission. Patterson's oldest friend was the district attorney. Patterson's former law partner was one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the state. Patterson had connections that stretched across every institution that mattered in the city. Patterson had a network. Patterson had influence. Patterson had the ability to make things very difficult for a police officer who just made him angry. Derek Munson had just made an enemy of the most powerful person in the room, and he was only now beginning to understand what that meant. I appreciate you identifying yourself, Patterson said, his voice still measured, still controlled, but with an edge underneath. "I'll make sure the department knows exactly what happened here today." He turned to Marcus. "I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened. You shouldn't have had to experience this at Riverside. You deserve better than this." Then Patterson turned back to Munson. "You can go. We're done here." Munson nodded slowly. His entire face had drained of color. He moved toward the terrace door, and every eye in the room followed him, every eye except Marcus's. Marcus was looking at Patterson. Patterson smiled slightly. It was a smile of solidarity, of, "I've got you," of the unspoken language of two men who understood something about power that others in the room were just beginning to grasp. The terrace fell silent after Munson left. Then slowly, almost tentatively, people began to speak again. The spell had been broken. The moment had passed. The incident was over. But the consequences, Patterson knew, were just beginning. Over the next few days, the story spread, not through social media, though it was there too, but through the network that actually mattered. The business community, the political establishment, the people who made decisions. Word traveled through channels of power in ways that were faster and more effective than any public announcement could be. A black businessman at the country club got humiliated by a cop. That became. A man was racially profiled by an officer with a documented history of excessive force. That became. The police department has a pattern that needs to be addressed. The story reached the ears of the police chief by Monday morning. Someone had called him, one of his members at the club, someone who'd witnessed it, and the chief understood immediately that this was serious. This wasn't an internal matter anymore. This was going to be public. This was going to be a problem. By Monday morning, the police chief had called Derek Munson into his office. Munson tried to explain. He told the chief about the reports of suspicious activity. He explained that he was just doing his job. He said that he'd been professional, that everything he did was in accordance with protocol. The chief listened without interrupting. When Munson was finished, the chief simply said, "Don't come back to work. You're suspended pending investigation." By Tuesday, civil rights groups were calling for his firing. The phone lines at the police department had been ringing all morning. Calls from lawyers, calls from advocates, calls from people who'd been paying attention. They'd all heard the story. Marcus Thompson, developer, humiliated at a country club by a cop, based on race. And they wanted action. By Wednesday, the district attorney, the mayor's oldest friend, was reviewing Munson's entire personnel file, all 7 complaints, the patterns, the way similar incidents had been handled at other police departments. At most departments, an officer with this many complaints would have been fired years ago, but at Riverside, the complaints had been dismissed. They'd been settled quietly. They'd disappeared. The district attorney understood what that meant. It meant the system had been protecting him. It meant the institution had made a choice to overlook his behavior. It meant this was bigger than one cop. By Thursday, a journalist at the Riverside Tribune had started investigating. Her name was Sarah Wright, and she was exactly the kind of journalist that police departments feared. Methodical, thorough, and willing to ask uncomfortable questions. She started with Derek Munson's 7 complaints, but she didn't stop there. She looked at how the department handled complaints against officers in general. She looked at the training records. She looked at the disciplinary patterns. She looked at the union contracts that made it nearly impossible to fire an officer without documentary proof of explicit racism. And she found something. The Riverside Police Department had implemented no racial bias training in the past 8 years. No equity training. No community relations program designed to address these issues. The department culture had been left entirely to the officers themselves to define. When officers define culture, it often reflects their worst assumptions. But Wright found something else, something far more damaging. In the past 5 years, black residents had filed 34 complaints about police stops in affluent neighborhoods. 34 separate incidents. All of them listed suspicious activity as the reason for the stop. None of them resulted in criminal charges. None of them resulted in apologies. None of them resulted in anything except a notation in the police database that was rarely reviewed and never acted upon. It was a pattern. It was a system. Wright obtained the body camera footage from 5 of these stops. In one incident, an officer had ordered a black woman out of her vehicle for a minor speeding violation. The woman had been driving to pick up her child from school. The officer had claimed to smell marijuana, though no marijuana was found anywhere in the vehicle. In another, an officer had conducted a full search of a car, taking 40 minutes while the driver waited on the side of the road. In a third, an officer had asked a black man to recite the alphabet backwards. A field sobriety test that had no legal basis. A test designed to test coordination or impairment. A test that had no place in a traffic stop. A test that suggested the officer had decided guilt before conduct. She filed a Freedom of Information Act request for Officer Derek Munson's work phone records. The department tried to resist. They said the records were confidential. They said they were personnel matters. They said they couldn't release private communication. But the district attorney stepped in. He made a phone call. He explained that these were work phones, that they were purchased with city funds, that they were therefore public record, that the department would comply. When Sarah Wright received them, she found the messages that would ultimately destroy Derek Munson's career. Text message from Munson to Officer Kyle Martinez, dated March 8th. Midlothian is easy pickings. Soccer moms don't lawyer up. That single sentence revealed the entire system. Munson wasn't randomly patrolling. He was targeting. He was identifying neighborhoods where he believed he could conduct stops without legal consequence. He was choosing victims based not on their behavior, but on where they lived, on their gender, on their likelihood of fighting back legally. Text message from Munson to an unknown number, dated March 15th. She complained. Don't worry, Union will handle it. Someone had filed a complaint. A woman had gone through the process, had tried to hold him accountable. And Munson's response was, don't worry, the Union will handle it. Meaning, the system will protect us. Meaning, you have no power here. Text message from Munson to Martinez, dated March 22nd. New chief is a problem. Asking too many questions. Lang says keep our heads down. There was institutional knowledge here. There was discussion of strategy. There was communication about how to conduct their operations in a way that wouldn't draw scrutiny. This wasn't one officer acting alone. This was a team. This was coordination. Text message from Munson to another officer, dated April 3rd. Just remember, if they got money in an expensive neighborhood, they must have gotten it somewhere dirty. That's how we think about it. This last message was the most damning, because it wasn't a moment of careless speech. It wasn't a joke that had gone too far. It was a statement of explicit ideology. It was Derek Munson, in writing, explaining the worldview that motivated his stops. It was him articulating the framework through which he saw the world. Poor black people were criminals. Rich black people were criminals with better lawyers. The money itself was suspicious. The success itself was evidence of guilt. That's how we think about it. That's how we think about it. Those 5 words contained the entire pathology of the system. By Friday, the story was on the front page of the Riverside Tribune. The headline screamed, Country Club Incident Exposes Department-Wide Racial Profiling. The article included Munson's text messages. It included the 34 prior complaints. It included the body camera footage from the stops. It included analysis showing that black residents were stopped in wealthy neighborhoods at a rate disproportionate to any reasonable crime statistic. The article painted a picture of a system that had been designed, deliberately and consciously, to target certain neighborhoods and certain people. The article included a statement from Mayor Patterson. What happened to Marcus Thompson at Riverside Country Club wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a department culture that tolerates, enables, and at times actively encourages racial profiling. That ends now. The words were simple, but the meaning was unmistakable. Patterson was stepping in. Patterson was using his power. Patterson was making this personal. On Saturday, the City Council called an emergency meeting. On Sunday, the Department of Justice announced a preliminary inquiry. Federal investigators would be looking at the Riverside Police Department. They would be examining the complaints. They would be reviewing the patterns. They would be investigating whether civil rights violations had been systematized. On Sunday evening, the police union released a statement through their attorney. Administrative oversight, no criminal intent, cooperating with the investigation. But the union's leadership was doing its own math. They were realizing that fighting this case publicly would be a disaster. Derek Munson's text messages were indefensible. A jury would see those messages and vote for termination in about 5 minutes. The union's leadership understood. If they fought this case, they would lose publicly, and it would set a precedent for future cases. It would establish that racial profiling was terminable, that documentation of racial targeting was indefensible, that the system wouldn't protect you if you left a paper trail. So they made a calculation. Let Munson go. Preserve capital for officers with winnable cases. Salvage what you can of the institution. Accept this loss to avoid total catastrophe. The union called Munson. They gave him a choice. Resign quietly, keep the pension, or fight and lose everything. Police Chief Robert Williams sat across from Derek Munson in the interrogation room at the police station. This was 4 days after the incident at the country club. 4 days of Munson trying to convince himself that this would blow over. That the system that had protected him for 22 years would protect him now. 4 days of that hope dying. 4 days of watching his career disintegrate in real time. Chief Williams opened a folder on the metal desk between them. Inside were the text messages, all of them, printed out, highlighted. Impossible to deny. I've been reading your file, Derek. 7 complaints, all dismissed. But I'm reading them differently now. I'm reading them in the context of what I'm seeing here. He tapped the folder. Munson's face had gone pale. Those were all handled. Text message from you to Officer Martinez. March 8th, you wrote. Midlothian is easy pickings. Soccer moms don't lawyer up. That's not you responding to crime. That's you identifying targets. That's you choosing neighborhoods and demographics specifically to stop people who won't fight back legally. That's you admitting that you're selecting victims based on their probability of legal resistance, not based on any actual criminal conduct. Chief, that was taken out of context. There is no context, the chief said flatly. You explicitly identified a neighborhood where you believed you could stop people without legal consequence. You identified them as soccer moms. You identified them as people who don't lawyer up. That's not protocol. That's not procedure. That's predatory. Text message from you. April 3rd. Just remember, if they got money in an expensive neighborhood, they must have gotten it somewhere dirty. That's how we think about it. There is no context where that sentence means anything other than racial intimidation. There is no interpretation where you're describing legitimate police work. You're explaining an ideology. You're articulating a framework in which black people, regardless of their wealth or status, are presumed to be criminals. Munson had no response. He sat there in the interrogation room, his entire identity collapsing in real time. You're suspended. Effective immediately. Pending termination. You can have a hearing. If you want, you can bring a union representative. You can fight this. But I want to be very clear about what that means. He leaned forward slightly. If you fight this, if you drag this through a public hearing, then every one of these text messages becomes public record. Every victim whose case you touched comes to testify. Every officer whose conduct you directed comes to testify. Your entire career, everything you've done, everyone you've targeted, becomes public. The media will cover it. National media. If the civil rights groups have anything to say about it, your name will be associated with racial profiling forever. The chief opened a laptop. He pulled up a few of the articles that had already been written. Your picture is already out there. Your name is already public. Your career is already over in terms of your professional reputation. The only question is whether you're going to fight this fight publicly, where everything gets worse, where your family is dragged into it, where you spend money you don't have on legal fees while losing anyway. Or whether you're going to accept this gracefully. Williams paused. Or you can resign. Quietly. We'll let you keep your pension. We'll issue a statement about administrative oversight. You walk away. You take your pension. You move on with your life. It's not the ending you wanted, but it's the ending you get. Munson understood. The protection had evaporated. The system that had held him up for 22 years had decided he was expendable. The calculation had been made. The cost-benefit analysis completed. Derek Munson wasn't worth the risk. How long do I have? By tomorrow, the chief said. I need your decision by tomorrow. Derek Munson resigned the next morning. He called the chief's office at 7 a.m. He said he was resigning effective immediately. He said he wasn't fighting it. He said he wanted to keep his pension and move on. The chief accepted the resignation. He said he'd put it in writing. The official announcement came from the city on Friday. Officer Derek Munson has resigned from the Riverside Police Department effective immediately. His peace officer certification is under review by the state. That last phrase, under review, was devastating because it meant that even if Munson wanted to work for another police department somewhere else, he couldn't. The certification that he'd built his entire adult identity around was being taken away. The State Review Board would examine his conduct. They would review the complaints. They would see the text messages. They would make a determination. The determination would be no. You don't get to keep this. But the resignation was only the beginning. The real reckoning came the following Tuesday at City Hall. The council chambers were packed. Over 50 people sat in folding chairs. 6 television cameras lined the back wall. Local news, national news, civil rights organizations. All 9 city council members were present. The mayor sat in the front row. Patterson was there. Visible, invested, making it clear that this wasn't just a procedural matter. This was the hearing on police department reforms. City Council member Lisa Taylor called the meeting to order. She laid out the facts methodically. On the day of the incident, Officer Munson had conducted a stop without reasonable suspicion. He'd demanded a search without probable cause. He'd used physical intimidation without justification. All documented on body camera, civilian recordings, and witness testimony. Chief Caldwell Byron stood, uniform pressed, voice clinical. He was the chief tonight, not the husband, not a friend. A chief answering for the conduct of his department. This is not isolated. This is a 6-year pattern of selective enforcement. Detective Wright has documented 34 prior stops with similar characteristics. This pattern involved multiple officers. This pattern was systematic. This pattern represents a failure of department leadership to properly train, supervise, and discipline our officers. The chief opened a presentation. He showed the data, the maps, the statistics. 34 stops in a specific neighborhood. Black residents at a rate 5 times higher than their population percentage. 89% of those stops resulted in no charges. Not because the people were innocent, but because there was no legitimate legal basis for the stop in the first place. Wright herself presented the data. She talked about the stops in Midlothian, the neighborhood that Munson had explicitly identified in his text messages as easy pickings. She talked about the pattern of stops that matched the profile Munson had described in his messages. Then came the victims. Renee Caldwell was the first to testify. She was an accountant, which meant she worked with data. She understood numbers and patterns and probabilities. She spoke with clarity about the day she'd been stopped, about being asked to step out of her vehicle without legal justification, about the search that took 45 minutes and yielded nothing, about her daughter in the back seat, about the message it sent, about the trauma it created. I'm an accountant. I work with data. The data says I was stopped for my skin color, but data doesn't show my daughter crying in the back seat. Data doesn't measure her nightmares. Data doesn't capture the moment when a 7-year-old asks her mother, "Are they going to take you away? Are they going to arrest you? Are we going to be okay?" She paused. Her voice had become steady again, but the emotion beneath it was palpable. 11 women before me complained, the system said. Not our problem. I'm number 12. The difference. My husband has power. That's not justice, that's luck. And luck shouldn't be the determining factor in whether you get treated with dignity. Marissa Williams testified about being asked to recite the alphabet backwards, a test that had no legal basis, a test that would only make sense as a field sobriety test. But she wasn't suspected of being intoxicated. She was suspected of being black in an expensive neighborhood. LaToya Johnson testified about missing her son's birthday because of a stop, about the trauma, about the anger, about the feeling of injustice. Kendra Anderson, who had a master's degree, who worked as an engineer, who'd grown up in Riverside, talked about the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, about the officer's tone, about the assumption embedded in every question. And then the counsel heard from other officers who had followed Munson's directives, officers who had received the messages, officers who had participated in the stops. Some of them defended the stops. Some of them claimed they didn't know what they were doing was wrong. Some of them took responsibility. Officer James Foster stood up. He was 34 years old. He'd been on the force for 8 years. He'd received messages from Munson. He'd participated in stops that matched the pattern. I didn't think about what I was doing at the time. I thought I was doing my job. I thought the neighborhood statistics justified the stops. But looking at it now, looking at the text messages, looking at the data, I realize I was wrong. I was part of a system that targeted people based on race. And I didn't speak up about it because it was easier not to. It was easier to follow orders. It was easier to participate. And I failed. The admission was powerful. The accountability was genuine. It shifted something in the room. Munson's attorney had prepared a statement. Munson himself wasn't present. He wasn't there to defend himself. He wasn't there to explain. He decided silence was his best option. Officer Derek Munson regrets any perception of impropriety. He served 22 years with distinction. He requests the council consider his full record. The statement was absurd. Any perception of impropriety. As if there was any ambiguity about what had happened. As if the text messages were open to interpretation. As if there was any reasonable doubt about his intent. Councilmember Lisa Taylor interrupted. His record includes 11 complaints, some involving explicit racial targeting, and text messages that prove deliberate discrimination. Text messages that show he identified neighborhoods and demographics for targeting. Text messages that reveal an ideology of suspicion toward black people. What should we consider? The parts where he was a good officer. Those don't exist. Every interaction he had with a black resident was potentially corrupted by his bias. Every stop he made needs to be reviewed. Every case he was involved with needs to be examined. His full record isn't a defense. His full record is an indictment. The vote came quickly. Terminate Munson's employment. 7 in favor. 2 opposed. Suspend officers Martinez, Foster, and Williams pending federal investigation. Unanimous. Pass Ordinance 2024-1118, establishing mandatory body cameras on all officers. Footage public within 72 hours. No suppression of evidence, no editing, no selective release, banning quotas, creating a civilian review board with subpoena power, requiring annual bias training, establishing a process for community complaint review. 8 in favor, 1 opposed. The gavel fell. Derek Munson's career was over. Over the next few days, the consequences extended far beyond Derek Munson. Within 1 month, 3 more officers resigned rather than face discipline for documented racial profiling incidents. They understood what Derek Munson had come to understand. The system that had protected them was failing. The protection had been revoked. The risk was no longer worth it. 12 officers completed the mandatory retraining and were returned to duty with probationary status. They attended quarterly sessions on constitutional policing, on implicit bias, on the Fourth Amendment protections that they were supposed to uphold but had been violating. Some of them learned something. Some of them just went through the motions. But the message was clear. There would be consequences for misconduct. The police department launched a recruitment drive. They hired a new class of officers that looked different from the old one. 30% black officers, 40% women. New officers who came into the department with different assumptions, who understood that they were being watched, who knew that the old ways of doing things had consequences. The Civilian Review Board held its first public meeting. It had subpoena power, which meant it could compel officers to testify. It had its own budget, which meant the department couldn't simply defund it. It had real authority. The culture began to shift. Not because officers suddenly became less racist, not because hearts were changed or minds were opened, but because the system stopped protecting racism. When the system stops protecting something, people stop doing it, at least in ways that generate complaints, at least in ways that can be documented. A young officer named Thomas Chen made an observation to his training officer during a routine patrol. "It feels different now. It feels like someone's watching." "Someone is watching," his training officer replied. "And that's the point. That's how you change behavior. You change the environment. You change the incentives. You make sure that doing the right thing is the easiest path, and doing the wrong thing is the hardest path. We used to reward officers for activity, for traffic stops, for searches, for making cases. Now we reward them for constitutional policing, for treating people with dignity, for building relationships in the community. It's a different calculus. But calculus is how behavior changes. Derek Munson, 3 months later, was living in a different state. He'd moved to Nevada, a place where nobody knew him, where his name meant nothing, where he could try to build something new. His pension was intact. The department had honored that. But his certification was gone. No police department in the country would hire him. No private security company wanted the liability. He was working as a security guard at a retail distribution center, making $45,000 a year, less than a third of what he'd made as a cop. He didn't go out much. He didn't tell people what he'd used to do. He existed in a kind of shadow, a man whose identity had been stripped away, a man whose self-image had been built entirely on a badge that was no longer available to him. He thought about Marcus Thompson sometimes. He wondered what Thompson was doing. He wondered if Thompson thought about what had happened. He wondered if Thompson felt vindicated or just exhausted. But more importantly, the message had been sent throughout the Riverside Police Department and to police departments beyond. The message was clear. Racial profiling will cost you your career, not a suspension, not retraining, not desk duty, your career. Everything you've built, everything you'll become. In Riverside, the precedent was set. 3 months after the termination hearing, Marcus Thompson sat at the same table on the terrace at Riverside Country Club. Same location, same lunch, same afternoon sunlight casting similar shadows. But everything else was different. The other club members treated him differently now. Not with contempt, but with respect. With a kind of deference that hadn't been there before. They understood that he had power, that he had connected with power, that he was part of the institutional structure now in a way that transcended his membership fee. A young officer walked onto the terrace. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was 28 years old. She was part of the police department's new diversity initiative, one of those new hires brought in to change the culture. She approached Marcus's table with genuine respect in her posture. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Officer Sarah Chen. I heard what happened to you. I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened. And it shouldn't happen to anyone else." Marcus set down his fork. He looked at Officer Chen for a long moment. She was nervous, she was sincere, but she was also something else. She was part of a system that was, however incrementally, beginning to change. You weren't there. "No," Officer Chen agreed. "But I'm here now, and I'm part of the department that's trying to be different. Being different is hard. It's easy to go back to the way things were. It's easy to slip into the old patterns when someone's not paying attention." "I know," Officer Chen said. "That's why I'm grateful for what you did. You didn't let them go back. You forced us to change. And that matters. It matters more than you probably realize." After she left, Marcus sat in silence for a while. He thought about Derek Munson, about the humiliation that had been reversed, about the power dynamic that had been flipped. He thought about the 34 prior stops, about the victims who'd finally been heard, about the system that had been forced to change. Justice wasn't healing. Justice wasn't forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, justice was the foundation on which both could be built. He thought about something Mayor Patterson had said to him after the hearing. This isn't about making Munson suffer. This is about making sure that when the next officer thinks about doing what Munson did, they think about what happened to him. Fear is a teacher. Sometimes it's the only teacher that works. Marcus understood what Patterson meant. Change didn't come from people suddenly becoming good. Change came from people understanding that there were consequences. Change came from fear. Fear of losing your career. Fear of losing your reputation. Fear of being exposed. It was a harsh calculus. But it worked. He looked around the terrace. The CEO of the bank smiled at him. The woman who ran the law firm nodded. The restaurant manager asked if he needed anything else. These small gestures, these recognitions, they mattered because they represented something deeper. They represented a shift in how power was calculated in this space. Marcus Thompson was no longer someone trying to belong. He was someone who belonged, who'd proven it, who'd used his power to demand accountability from the system. This story isn't unique. It's repeated in cities across America, in Boston and Atlanta, in Los Angeles and Miami, in Chicago and Philadelphia, in every major city and many small towns. Somewhere right now, someone is being profiled by someone with authority. Someone is having their dignity stripped away by someone who believes they have the right to do it. Someone is experiencing the exact same helplessness, the exact same rage, the exact same calculation about what will happen if they fight back. The question isn't whether racial profiling exists in police departments across America. The data proves it does. The question isn't whether systems enable it. The evidence shows they do. The question is much simpler than that. The question is, what will you do when you witness it? Will you stay silent? Will you pretend it's not happening? Will you tell yourself that someone else will handle it? That it's not your problem? That you don't have the right to intervene? Or will you be the person who says something? The person who uses whatever power you have to push back against injustice? The person who refuses to participate in silence? Marcus Thompson didn't need Mayor James Patterson to save him. What he needed was for someone with power to acknowledge what was happening, to say it out loud, to use their authority not to protect the system, but to expose and reform it. That's available to all of us. Not all of us are mayors. Not all of us have a brother on the police commission or a best friend at the district attorney's office. Not all of us have connections that stretch across institutions. But all of us have power in some form. We have the power to speak. We have the power to witness. We have the power to refuse complicity. We have the power to say, "No, this ends now." In the end. The thing that changed Riverside wasn't Derek Munson's removal from the police force. It was the decision by one person with power to say, "This ends now." It was the decision to use authority not to protect the corrupt, but to expose them in your city, in your community, in your workplace. There's a person with power. Maybe it's you. The question is, what will you do? Will you notice when someone is being treated unjustly? Will you recognize the moment when power is being abused? And will you be willing to use whatever authority you have to push back? Because change doesn't happen because systems suddenly become fair. Change happens because people with power decide that the cost of injustice is too high. Change happens because consequences are real. Change happens because someone, somewhere, decides that it's worth the risk to say no. If this story meant something to you, if it resonated with you, if it made you think about power and responsibility and what you're willing to do in the face of injustice, then share it. Not for clicks or views, though those matter too. Share it because patterns only change when people refuse to look away. Because systems only reform when there's public pressure. Because Derek Munson's career only ended because an entire community demanded accountability. Your voice matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. The stand you take when you witness abuse of power, that matters too. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about power, justice, and the people who stood up against systems designed to oppress them. Because these stories aren't just about what happened. They're about what's possible when ordinary people decide that they're not going to stay silent anymore. The country club is still there. The police still patrol. But now, so do the cameras and the people behind them. And that makes all the difference.